Good morning. My name's Jeff, and I'm one of the pastors here. I'm going to be sharing today's teaching. For those of you who've been here, you know that all summer we've been in a series through the book of Proverbs, ancient wisdom for the modern era. Proverbs is ancient Hebrew wisdom literature. It covers how to be wise, how not to be foolish when you can't discern what to do in a given situation because it's not specifically condemned or condoned in God's law. How do you make decisions? And that exercise is called wisdom. And so Proverbs is a book of wisdom. And we have been, if you've been here, you know that we have been in a series within a series, Wisdom for the Family. As a pastor for over 20 years, I know that some of the most painful, as well as joyful, but some of the most painful and heavy burdens that we bear are a result of relationships that have been damaged or broken with the people that we love the most. And we looked at relationships in the previous weeks between husbands and wives, and we looked at relationships between children and parents. Some of the most significant relationships, also the source of some of the most heartbreak you're going to experience in life. And for the last week, we looked at wisdom for your relationships. I don't know a person who hasn't gone through some kind of relational strain, and the pain that you feel is usually directly proportional to the proximity of that relationship, right? You can lose a cursory friendship or something like that. Maybe somebody offends somebody else and you just never talk to them again, and you feel that a little bit. But when it's a child and when it's a spouse, oh my goodness, it would be better to have a limb severed off in many respects. And so last week, we looked at the wisdom for relationships and how do you heal from anger. We looked at Matthew, where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, if you've become angry with your brother, you've murdered him in your heart. And today we're going to continue in that vein. We're going to look here in Proverbs. I'm going to read the passage on which the teaching's based. There's several of them. And these are a small sampling of dozens of verses in Proverbs, and you're going to catch a repetitive vibe here that all essentially say very similar things. So if you have your Bibles, I want to invite you, you could turn to Proverbs 14. I'll be reading selected verses from 14, 15, 16, 19, 24, and 25. The words are going to be on the screen behind me. If that's all too much for you, there's a copy of my notes out on the table. You can grab, he loves the notes. And you can grab them on the way out. Roland will probably shove a copy in your hand as you leave. So let me read the text on which this teaching is based, and then we'll get into it. Proverbs 14, 29 through 30. Whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 15:18. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. Proverbs 16:32. Better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. Proverbs 19:11. A person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Proverbs 19:19. A hot-tempered person must pay the penalty. Rescue them, and you will have to do it again. Proverbs 24. Do not testify against your neighbor without cause. Would you use your lips to mislead? Do not say, I'll do to them as they have done to me. I'll pay them back for what they did. Proverbs 25:21 through 22. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. This is the word of the Lord. We live in a moment where anger is epidemic. I probably don't have to make the case to you after the tragedy of this week where Charlie Kirk was assassinated in front of the entire world. As disgusting as that was, as absolutely loathsome as that was, what happened immediately after I found just as grotesque. People on both sides gearing up, mounting arguments, throwing vitriol, and the reality is one of the reasons that our moment is, and I would say we are in the middle of an anger epidemic. If you're old enough, maybe you recognize it, but for many of us, it's like being the frog in the kettle. We've just kind of lived with it for so long, we're scarcely cognizant of it. But the amount of vitriol, the amount of rancor, the amount of anger that we have in our culture, that we have in our lives by extension, is palpable. You can cut it with a knife. It's excruciating. And there's some reasons for that. One is there is a popular idea in our present moment, and this has really kind of been the case since the 60s and 70s, when popular psychology kind of got its feet under it. And the idea, you might recognize it, is one that says, well, if you feel something, you should express it. If you have something inside you, if you have some kind of anger, you need to give voice to that anger. That's healthy. That's self-expression. That's what we should do. You've probably heard that in some way, shape, or form. The other thing, which is interesting, it coincides with that and kind of brought us to where we are in our current cultural moment, is the advent of social media and the internet. You can actually track the moment, and it was Facebook that did it initially, but about 10 years ago, they changed their algorithm to accentuate posts and content that were divisive. Some of those, the brain trust over at Facebook figured out that if they accentuated and propelled content that seemed to elicit vitriol and rancor and anger, that it got a lot more traction online. And there's been studies and graphs that will show you there's a total corollary between that exact moment in time and the advent of this kind of new season of collective anger that we all now find ourselves immersed in. Now that's collectively, that's corporately, but you have to see the connection. We live in this world. We're swimming in this pool. There's no way that you can really extricate yourself from the influence of what's happening in our cultural moment in respect to this epidemic of anger. And so our lives end up becoming impacted by this, because when anger gets the best of us, and if I'm the only one, I'll shut up. But when anger gets the best of us, what happens is our relationships are burdened, oftentimes destroyed, sometimes, lifelong friendships, familial relationships, kids and parents, and husbands and wives. When we give anger a foothold in our lives, those relationships are strained, sometimes broken, sometimes irrevocably. And so I'd like to take a look at these Proverbs today and some New Testament corollaries, which kind of expose and explain anger in a way that's maybe a little more nuanced than we get in our out there in the culture, where it just says, "Oh, you're feeling that? You should give voice to it." Let me start by giving just a brief outline. In respect to anger, there is the good, there is the bad, and then there is the holy. The good, the bad, and the holy. So first, the good. Anger in and of itself isn't bad. It has been called the dynamite of the soul. Paul says something really interesting in Ephesians. He says in Ephesians 4:26, "In your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry." In your anger do not sin. Be angry, sin not. So anger in and of itself isn't the problem. Anger is the dynamite of the soul. It's a kind of, I don't know about you, but for me, it's a kind of nuclear force that happens when something offends me, when someone I love is threatened. There is a kind of spontaneous combustion that happens. We looked at the word anger in Greek last week, and it's a word that literally means swollen. Like if a plant, it was swollen with too much sap. That's the direct corollary for the word that Jesus and Paul and James use for anger. So it's like incredible Hulk-like explosive anger. That's what's being condemned. What you see Paul says, in your anger do not sin. So anger in and of itself is not the problem. It is sinning that's the problem. Proverbs 14:29, I'll just take a look at it again for us, says, "Whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly." Being quick-tempered. being somebody whose anger gets the better of them and then it explodes in various uncalculated directions, doing harm and having ramifications that you did not foresee because you were caught up in the moment and you let the pressure build up and then you exploded. The other thing is Proverbs 16:32 says, better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. The Bible doesn't command us not to get angry. What it does do is it condemns explosive, impulsive anger. And there's a lot of people who will look at the New Testament and say, well, look at Jesus. Jesus got angry. Jesus did get angry multiple times. You can read places like John, where John's gospel, Jesus, he goes into the temple and he sees the money changers. People would take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the holy city, 3 times a year for the high holidays. And they had various forms of currency. And what these money changers would do is they would exchange the money and they would gouge the prices. And what they were basically doing was they were trampling on the heads of the poor. They were exploiting people so they could buy sacrifices to go sacrifice at the temple. And Jesus sees this and he gets angry. And then you're going to notice, if you're familiar with the story, what Jesus does in light of this anger is he doesn't have an uncalculated, explosive rage. He has a slow and measured response to what he sees as an egregious injustice. The text tells us that he goes and makes a whip. Years ago, I was teaching on this for my youth group, and I actually had them make a whip. It takes a while, you know. You've got to braid some cords and such. And the type of whip that is in view here is the kind that you would use to drive a herd of sheep or something like that, if you can picture it in your mind's eye. And then he goes into the temple, and then he drives out the money changers, and he turns over their table. And so Jesus' anger is righteous, and it's not a sin at all. So anger in and of itself isn't inherently bad, but there's a problem. And the problem, we see it in James 1. This is another one of those classic texts on anger. It says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. You'll see people sometimes marshal those texts, those examples where Jesus gets angry. Those examples, and the turning over the tables in the temple is the classic one. It's been depicted in so many different, like film and TV, and it's this really interesting picture. And you think, wow, that's Jesus, the guy with the fuzzy little lamb, and here he is beating people with a whip. Interesting. And we will use that to say, well, I'm justified. My anger is justified. I have righteous indignation. You might, but the chances are you probably fall more into the category that I fall into when I get angry, and that's the one that James describes. That because I am human, my anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. There is righteous anger. There is righteous anger. I'm willing to bet, and take a wager, that the vast majority of the anger that is represented in this room right now doesn't fall into that category. Because we have a kind of brokenness inside us that tends to mar and twist everything towards sin. But anger can be good. Anger is, what is being condemned in here is quick, impulsive, hot-tempered, explosive anger. The kind of anger that you see Jesus sitting with and marshaling. It's that righteous indignation when you see something that is not as it should be, and then you have a measured, thoughtful response to it. That's what's being commended. Now, just by way of example, I can think of a few classic examples in our recent history where righteous anger was a good thing. You can look to the abolitionist movement. Christians like William Wilberforce, who saw the transatlantic slave trade and thought, these are people created in the image of God. He was a Christian man. He believed the Bible. And he said, this is wrong. This is not right. And he had a deep-seated sense that God was calling him to do something about it. And him and many others were a big part of the reason that the transatlantic slave trade was obliterated. You can look to the suffrage movement in our country's not-so-distant history, where women were not allowed to vote. There were the suffragettes who, by the same token, were at risk to life and limb and imprisonment and the rest stood up for the rights of all women in this country. That was a kind of righteous anger that had a very positive outcome. You can look at the civil rights movement in our own country. Personally, I've experienced a kind of righteous anger when somebody very close to me, somebody I love very much, was destroying their life with alcohol and substances. And it would not have been love for me to show any kind of indifference in that situation. If I'd been apathetic to that situation, if I had not gotten angry, that would have been just as big a sin. And as a result, there were a bunch of people, there were enough people who cared about this individual, and we were so broken by it that we got together from across the country, and we sat this person down, and we told them that they had to change. And so there can be good, positive outcomes from anger. But it is a sin for anger to blow up just as much as it is a sin for anger to never show up at all. If anger either blows up or never shows up, it's a sin. I've coached for many years, and sadly I've seen this kind of play out where I'll have an athlete on the wrestling team, and they'll be making bad choices. They'll be starting to do drugs, getting involved with the wrong people, alcohol, just blowing off school. I can tell. I've been around the block. I know how this story ends, and it starts breaking my heart. And then I meet their parents, and I'll say something to the parents, and they'll just be like, "Oh yeah, he's going to do that," And there's a sense of apathy. That is just as much a sin. So anger can be a sin if it blows up or if it never shows up at all. But it can be a good thing. It's not necessarily inherently in and of itself a bad thing. I'll tell you another reason why anger can be a good thing. It will show you what you love. Anger can show you what you love. When we have disordered loves. Paul calls these things idols. There are things in our life that vie for primacy and preeminence in our life that are not Jesus. And when one of those things is threatened, we will have a disproportionate response to it, right? And this leads us to kind of the bad side of anger. But let me explain this by way of my own silly, ridiculous life that is prone to anger and blowing up at stuff. I'll give you a couple of my pet peeves. All right, I remember I was just out of the Marines, and I was on a job interview many years ago. It was at the YMCA, and they asked me, they got that book she had the book on her desk about job interview questions. She said, "What makes you angry?" I was like, "I don't know." And I thought about it, and I was like, "I got to come up with something." I said, "Flag burners." I got the job. You know what bugs me now? When I'm at the gym, and there's a rule. There's 5 rules in the gym. One of them is don't sit on the equipment and text message all your friends. There's one pull down in that whole place. And I get a little uppity about it, right? I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for that one piece of equipment, and somebody's out there posting on Instagram, and I'm checking the time. I know how long their interval should be in between sets. And if it elapses that, I get pretty critical. I get pretty miffed. Well, the other day, I was in the gym, and this person, I was within my 30-second to 1 minute in between reps, and I fired off a quick text message, and I look up, and he's sneering at me. And I felt, I was like, "You're sneering at me? I am the keeper of the 4th commandment up there. I am so critical of other people that do that." And I was instantly like, this weasel, I'm going to describe him for you. He's like a weaselly little guy. And I thought, who are you to look at me? I was within my 1 minute. And I had a disproportionate response because I was snubbed. He's snubbed. He looked down at me. I don't know this guy from Adam. I haven't seen him since. But I spent the next 9 days thinking of all the things I would do and say to him because I felt so slighted because he snubbed me. He looked at me critically. And my response is disproportionate. Because in that time, there are 2 major wars being fought around the globe, countless atrocities. Gosh, turn on the news, open X, look at it. There's all kinds of things that should break my heart far more severely than that, but that was the thing. Because I have disordered loves. I'm a broken, sinful person, and when something happens to me, I tend to respond in a very disordered way. I will get piping mad because somebody gave me a dirty look at the gym, but then I will read these other things with like passing interest. Anger has, because of our brokenness, we have a way of, the expression of our anger ends up becoming disordered. The other thing it does is the goal of the anger. I'll give you another example. Jesus' anger is righteous. His goal is to stand up for the poor and the marginalized. When I get angry, quite frequently, the goal of that anger is really nothing noble. It's mostly revenge, and it feeds my ego. I was walking the dogs with my son, Jason, my youngest, the other day, and we live up in the mountains, and the roads are quite windy. And all of a sudden, this car is coming down. He comes around the bend, and it's coming pretty fast. And I thought, usually, as a courtesy, when you're walking dogs and you have a kid, that person would slow down. And as he gets closer, I just see this guy through his window, and he's just staring at his phone. Why do you do that on those roads? I have no idea. It seems like a really bad idea. But as he passed me, I had all kinds of stuff go through my head. Like, I wanted to follow him home. And then maybe I had some ideas about, I might get to illustrate to him the foolhardiness of that, looking at your phone on that road. My response was the goal of my anger. It wasn't to confront the behavior, it was to confront the person. My goal, the thing that my heart initially snapped to was not to I should really find this fella and explain to him the dangers of texting on high mountain roads, and maybe explaining the dangerous situation he put me and my son and my dogs in. There was none of that. I wanted to shake him for a long time. It happens with your kids. Maybe it happens with your spouse. They do something, and with my kids, it's like this: they make a decision, or they engage in an activity or behavior, or they believe a certain thing. Where I'm like, "That's stupid. Why are you doing that? You're going to ruin your life. This is going to have nothing good is going to come out of this." And instead of being mad at the idea, the action, or the behavior, I become mad at the child, the individual. I don't want to choke out the idiocy. I want to choke the idiot. So my heart has all kinds of disordered things in it, and when I become angry, it releases this kind of like explosive level 5 nuclear force. And if I am not patient, and if I'm not slow to anger, like Paul is telling us, I will make all kinds of mistakes with it. Now, those are like kind of interpersonal ramifications. I want to give you a couple of like interior ramifications, because these are real. Proverbs 14:29 says, "Whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." Your translation might not say envy there. The word is often translated passion. But passion rots the bones. I have, at times, since I've been the pastor of this church, had high blood pressure. Can you believe that? And I had to get one of those, I can't ever say it, sphygmomanometer. I had to get one of those. And there have been times when I have had to go home and take my blood pressure, and it's like dangerously high. When you are angry, you have a physiological, biological response. Now, I was talking to my wife about this. I don't know if you recognize this, but let me make some generalizations that'll offend somebody. Men have a habit of blowing up. Can I get an amen, ladies? Do we agree? Men are maybe predisposed towards this kind of explosive, pressure cooker, Incredible Hulk-like anger. And women, maybe not so much. My wife tells me, and I'll have to take her word on it, that for women, a lot of times anger isn't projected outwards. You tend to like kind of bury it inside. And you tend to, and that anger, if maybe not expressed, this is why Paul says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. Anger needs some kind of an outlet. It needs some kind of a pressure valve on it. But whether you explode outwardly or you internalize it, if you internalize it, it creates bitterness, which will rot your bones. It will do things to your soul. You'll end up thinking things about people in your interior life. You'll end up harboring grudges. Or if you explode outwardly, that's not good either. And especially, I could say this, men, fathers, husbands, we have been given a special responsibility to lead in our homes and in our families. And if you absolutely want to destroy your credibility with the people God has called you to lead, you can explode. And I'm only telling you from personal experience. We have an expression in the Marines, and it's 1 oh no takes the place of 10 attaboys. There were different words there. I'll let you use your imagination. But you can make 100 really good calls as a father, a husband, and a leader in your home. And then if you lose your cool one time and you punch a hole in the wall or break a microwave, I'm not saying I've ever done either of those, you will destroy your credibility with the people God's called you to lead. You have to have, there is something that happens. Like when anger gets the best of you, when you're quick-tempered, when you flare up, when you explode, or when you internalize. And this is, you're biochemically, what happens? You produce cortisol, you produce adrenaline. This is the other thing that's very interesting as I studied anger this week. It has cognitive implications. 14, again, one who is quick-tempered displays folly. You'll recognize this. Have you ever been angry and done something stupid you regret? There's a reason. Because if you're quick-tempered, it's going to produce folly. When you are angry, all of a sudden your brain gets flooded with adrenaline and flooded with cortisol, and those things are coursing through your capillaries. And like when I get cut off in traffic and all of a sudden there's a vein popping on the side of my temple, I'm not thinking clearly. When somebody offends me, when somebody snubs me, when one of my kids does something that I think is horrendous or stupid, all of a sudden I get angry, and the thing that happens is where you engage with most of your logical reason is the front of your brain. They put people in an MRI machine. I don't know what they did to make them angry, but they made them angry, and then they stuck them back in the machine, and the center of your thought actually migrates to a different part of your brain. You no longer think with the logical part of your brain. You think with kind of a fight or flight response. It destroys your ability to be rational and to be logical. If I'm the only one, I'll stop now. So it has cognitive implications. And then this one's the Bible. I tell you, the book's 2,000 years old, or even more than that in the case of Proverbs. Shockingly relevant. Proverbs 19. A hot-tempered person may pay the penalty. Rescue them, and you will have to do it again. Anger is the emotion that is most like a drug. It's like an addictive substance. You'll recognize this. Somebody does something to you, you get angry. And then 24 hours later, you're telling somebody else about that something somebody did to you because you can't wait to vent and do something with this anger, so you're going to smash their character. And then what do you have to do? You have to rekindle that anger. Just as you're telling them the story, you're telling yourself the story again in order for you to get angrier to justify your anger that you had in the first place. It creates a feedback loop in us. And it's like a drug. I'm going to be angry with you. That means if I'm going to be angry, I have to continue to be more angry in order to justify the initial anger. And it creates this kind of feedback loop, and it's an addictive substance. If you know people who are just like you would say, that's an angry person, they have been trapped in that feedback loop, and they're not going to get off until something breaks it. That brings me to my final point, the holy. So what do you do? Because we've all been there. Something happens. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, has colorful hand gestures. Somebody took your spot in line at the post office. One of your kids, did something that you told them not to do, and they went and did it anyway, and now it's a big disaster. What do you do? Proverbs also has some really sage advice for us. Proverbs 14:29. Whoever is patient has great understanding. You have to be wise. You have to be wise. We are all leaders. I mentioned earlier that men have a kind of special provision within their relationships with their wife and their children. And so I'm talking to men because we're the ones who typically blow up. There is a reason. Have you noticed every image of a man that you see on television is a hapless, moronic buffoon prone to anger? Because that's what most of us experienced. Right? I'm thinking of Red from That 70s Show, Homer Simpson, the dad from Malcolm in the Middle. I could go on. They're all kind of this archetype. We all have the burden of leadership on us. Men, women, husbands, wives, children, parents. There's a concept, a leadership concept that I want to give you, and it's called ownership. If you are in a situation, if something goes sideways in one of your relationships, if somebody's hurt, if somebody's injured, if there's anger on one or both sides, I want to encourage you to do this, to stop, because the impulsive, explosive, instantaneous anger has been condemned. What it's saying is anger is not wrong, but slow, measured response, angry. That is what the Bible is teaching us. You have to pause, and you have to ask yourself this question: how much of this can I own? How much of I promise you, if you're anything like me, usually it's more than half. But even if you're in a situation and you stop, you take 7 deep breaths. It works. Try it. 7 deep breaths. And you say, what did I do or say to arrive at this present circumstance? What in this argument, what in this hurt and heartbreak can I own? You know what that is? That is a pressure release valve. I didn't know this. My wife taught me you can make corn in a pressure cooker. Did you ever use a pressure cooker? If you just try to open it without using the pressure release valve, it explodes. But it has a cute little valve on top that if you press it just right, the steam comes out of it. What that is a pressure release valve for your soul. If you can look at a situation and understand, well, I think, I did contribute to that. And you might have to actually give it some thought. You might have to have understanding. And look back over the previous weeks and months and think, okay, this is where I contributed to the hurt and the heartbreak that we're both experiencing right now. That's a pressure release valve. It becomes a lot more likely that you'll be able to have a patient and measured response with that person in that situation if you can recognize your own fault. Absorb it. So you have reason, take responsibility. This is the next one, Proverbs 24:28-29 says, do not testify against your neighbor without cause. Would you use your lips to mislead? Do not say, I'll do to them as they have done to me. I'll pay them back for what they did. That's a challenging text. And you see this echoed throughout the New Testament teachings. This is the Christian non-retaliation ethic. Not one of my favorites. Because when somebody wounds me, I want to wound them back. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye. I like that part. Right? Except I don't do eye for an eye. I do like an eye for a heartbeat. Because I tend to kind of amplify things, and I'm creative. I can come up with ways. That's my impulse. But what the Bible is saying here, and what Jesus says when he says, if somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek. I remember when I first became a Christian, and I read through the Bible, and I saw that part. I said, wait a minute. I went to my pastor, and I was like, are there any loopholes to this? I don't know if I can do this. There is a way. But this is a very heavy lift. And so one of the things we're called to do when we're in conflict, when there is anger, shared anger, or maybe it's like directional one-way anger, is to absorb it. Absorb it. It's not easy, right? The next one I'll give you is, and this one, it just keeps getting better, by the way. Proverbs 25:21 says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. When I first became a Christian, The very next verse that I came to, my pastor was telling me, well, when somebody wounds you, if they strike you, you got to turn the other cheek. And then he went right here and he said, what you got to do is heap burning coals of kindness upon their heads. And I thought, I like it. It sounds violent. It's not what that means, however. What this means is, it's absolutely shocking when you look at it in the context of ancient wisdom literature. Every ancient civilization had a code, and there's literature from all these different civilizations, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and all of them have something like, do not avenge, don't take revenge, right? It's pretty common. None of them say this. This is astounding. This is just mind-blowing. This is saying not only are you to not take revenge, but you are to actually work for the redemption of that person. Look what it says. It says, if he's hungry, give him something. Jesus would quote this verse. If he's hungry, give him something to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water. And in doing so, you're going to heap burning coals of kindness upon his head. And you will melt the heart of anger, and you will melt the heart of indifference. You'll melt the heart of apathy through your kindness. You are supposed to actively engage in ministering to that person in a way where your patience and wisdom and grace and sacrifice in that situation is supposed to redeem them. Which brings me to my final point. You won't be able to do any of this unless you see that you're a sinner saved by grace. It will be impossible. You will engage in, spontaneous combustion. You'll engage in incredible Hulk-like anger. You may bury it deep inside, and as a result, have a kind of bitterness that rots you from the inside out and impedes and interferes with your relationships and your outlook and just mars your soul. And you won't be able to do any of it unless you realize that you're a sinner saved by grace. When Moses encounters God, he asks God what his name is in Exodus. And God says, my name is the Lord, slow to anger. When God chose his personal pronoun, that's what he gave. He said, I am the Lord, slow to anger. That's who he is. And if you never realize that you were in such desperate need of forgiveness, I assume there's a Far Side cartoon. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Far Side cartoons, where this guy goes up and he's standing at the pearly gates in front of St. Peter, and St. Peter opens the book with all the bad things he's done, and the scroll just rolls across the floor. That's what it's like. You've probably got your top 10, but trust me, you have sinned against him in a million ways you're scarcely aware of. And he is God Almighty. He spoke the universe into existence. He holds you together down to the tiniest amino acid by a word of his power. He gave us his word to live by, and we, at every turn, we sin against him. And let me show you how, in the context of this topic. When you are angry with somebody, you have horizontal anger. That's anger towards the person who has insulted you, who has snubbed you, who has wounded you. And then you also have vertical anger. And that's what happens when you shake your fist at the sky and say, why did this happen? Why me, Lord? When something comes into your life that you think, maybe I wouldn't have chosen that for myself, now you're angry with God, and I'll prove it to you. The minute that Jesus Christ became killable, we killed him. And you might think, well, if I were there that day at Golgotha, I wouldn't have done it. Yeah, you would have. Because all of us have a kind of a broken, disordered love in our hearts, and when we get angry, it blows up and it goes in all the wrong directions. But God, because he is slow to anger, he doesn't give us wrath, which is what we deserve. He gave us Jesus. Jesus tells a parable in Matthew 18, and it's about a man who owes a lot of money, a ridiculous sum of money. And the king actually forgives him his debts. And then this same man goes out to another man who owes him a relatively insignificant amount of money, and he demands payment for that money. That is the futility, that is the ridiculousness of the situation we find ourselves in when we have this kind of explosive, violent, vitriolic anger towards people. We have been forgiven so much. The only way that you're going to have patience in situations, the only way that you're going to be able to heap burning coals of kindness upon people's heads and redeem them in the midst of their anger, the only way that you're going to be able to forgive people, and I know there are people that there's a lot of forgiving is required. The only way you're ever going to do it is see that you are a sinner saved by grace. Martin Luther said, we carry his very nails in our pockets. It was so much love and so much grace and so much mercy that was needed for Jesus to go to that cross. That's what was required. There was none of us who could have paid that debt on our own, but it was paid for us. And so if you can see yourself, you look at the cross and you say, that's my sin paid for. That's what it took. It took nothing less than the death of Jesus to pay for my sin. Now you're going to have a resource for patience and forgiveness and for being angry and sinning not. This concludes the teaching of God's word.